Okay, good morning, everyone. So, as we have an exam coming up, we have a review today, and I'm recording it, and hopefully it will record. So, as always, I gave people this opportunity because I don't know what people don't know. So I asked people to send me questions if they had questions, and gave the bonus for doing so. So, Section 5, Reform and Fall of the Qing.
Good morning.
We had this question, what role, the parts in bold, of course, are the ones where people had questions. So there was this question, what role did missionaries play in China? What positive influence did they have? What conflicts and misunderstandings might appear? How could these lead to attacks on Christianity? How did Christianity challenge Gentry Power and Confucian ideals? And what problems did all these cause for the Qing government? So remember, in this, we talked a lot about Catholicism early on, and Catholics are still there. I just tend to focus more on Protestants because they were a little bit more active. For example, the United States and Great Britain are the two big powers in the world this time, and they're both mostly Protestant. So Protestant Christianity is going to be really growing during this time period. And it's interesting, Protestant missionaries, like Catholic missionaries, don't just understand Christianity as being part of a series of doctrines. There are certain aspects of civilization, certain ideas that go along with it. So remember that the Jesuits tried to convert Chinese by focusing on how they had knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, right? Matteo Ricci, for example, helped translate Euclid's geometry. Protestants will be doing that, but with 19th and early 20th century science and technology. So they want to save China not only in the next world. They don't want to just have more Chinese people going to heaven. They also want to bring positive change to China. And they see Christianity, they look at the world and say, you know what? Most powerful countries in the world are Protestant Christian. Why are they powerful? Because they're Protestant Christian. If you want to become powerful, you need to become Protestant Christian too. And they would argue that ideas like democracy and capitalism come out of Protestant Christianity. So they're bringing in this idea of Western civilization, focusing on liberal democracy and science. And it will often help in concrete ways by helping to translate Western books into Chinese. So for example, people often use international law to try and force China to do things. They say, China, you violate international law here, so you have to pay a fine or something like that. And what happened was, once international law was translated to Chinese, people couldn't take advantage of China as easily. Because the Chinese would say, oh no, we didn't violate the law, because look here, look at this law. See, it says it's okay for us to do this. The missionaries in China could be critics as well. They would criticize things they saw in China. This could be beneficial and also negative at times, right? Sometimes you need some criticism. Sometimes they could go too far. Now, what's also important is when they were in China, they also built institutions, right? Usually, especially Protestant Christians, were really good at building hospitals and schools to both give Chinese the fruits of advanced Western technology, like advanced Western medicine, and also to help educate them. So you had then these Western people, these missionaries would learn Chinese, but would also teach Western languages. And that gave them important connections with Chinese people, especially with students, particularly ones who became Christians. So to give you an example of that, because these missionaries knew Chinese and could teach in Chinese and also could teach Western languages, they built contacts with people like Mary Stone, helped her to learn English, so she could then later go to the United States and become one of the first women Chinese to become medical doctors, or I should say, Western medical doctors. So that's an example, and this is much more positive. Now, one thing you see in this class, though, is that, there's usually a negative side as well to things. And to give an example of that, talking about misunderstandings, we emphasize Catholics because of particular Catholic theological beliefs, baptize babies. And oftentimes Catholics would go around and pick up babies that had been abandoned, and a lot of babies were being abandoned in China, and would baptize them. And unfortunately, sometimes a large number of those babies would die. It's not the Catholics' fault. They'd been left on the road for several days, so they weren't in good health. But this led to people saying, why is it that these Catholics, they pick up these babies, they baptize them, and then the babies die? What are they doing to them? And this led to rumors as seen as this image here. Here you see Catholic priests removing a baby from a Chinese woman in order to get its organs to make medicine. Right? There was this idea, why is Western medicine so powerful? Why is it so good? Well, they get it in this way. They get it from the organs of other people. And so you have these kinds of rumors. And to give you an example, in 1870, there was this thing called the Tianjin Massacre, in which a large number of Westerners including 10 Catholic nuns, were killed by an anti-Christian riot. Right? There were all these Chinese who were angry at Christians. Now what caused this? There were rumors, such as the ones depicted here. Right? There were rumors. And one reason why Chinese believed these rumors was because many Western people were behaving badly. Right? This is a time of Western imperialism, when Western people would come into China and take advantage of China's weakness. So when people, start wars with your country, it's not hard to believe things like this, right? It's fairly reasonable to believe things like that. In addition, the Christianity challenged Gentry Power and Confucian ideals. Remember the Gentry, this very important social class, their position in society comes from their mastery of Confucian knowledge and performing Confucian rituals. But Christians say you shouldn't perform those Confucian rituals. You should not engage in acts that are seen as worship of Confucius. You should not worship your ancestors. That's wrong. There's only one God whom you should worship. So Christians put themselves in competition with these gentry, who were very important, and they often led these anti-Christian actions. They were often led by the gentry, and it was, remember, the gentry who produced images like this to spread this kind of anti-Christian enmity. What also hurt things is while some Chinese became Christians because they believed in the doctrine, others became Christians to get connections with powerful Western missionaries. Because missionaries sometimes, for example, if you were in a law dispute, if you were like in a court case conflict over land or something like that, if you became a Christian, sometimes the missionary would come to court to help you out. So you had a powerful friend. So that made enemies, of course, as well. And of course, the Chinese who are converted to Christianity just for power are not going to be very good Christians and will often misbehave. In this case, the Qing, they're put in a very difficult position because the Chinese people say, these Westerners are behaving badly, you need to deal with them. The Qing are not able to deal with them, so the Chinese say, we'll deal with them. Then the Westerners are angry, and the Qing have the option of either punishing the Chinese who engage in the riots or punishing the Westerners. And the Westerners are more powerful, so they punish the Chinese. And the Chinese say, what's the Qing Empire doing? Whose side is it on? I thought they were supposed to protect Confucianism in China, but they're not doing it. They're protecting these foreigners. So you can kind of see the conflicts and these issues here. So we had the next question, someone did ask a question about section 6. How did the power structure change in the Qing Empire in the second half of the 19th century? What role did Li Hongzhang play in the new power structure? So one thing you'll notice is that we pretty much in the 19th century, we don't talk much about emperors. The major one we talk about in the second half of the 19th century is Guangzhou, but he was a puppet. This guy really didn't wield much power. The one time he tried to wield power during the 100 Days of Reform, he quickly lost power. So what happened is, after the Second Opium War, you're going to have a series of weak emperors. And you'll have the rise of this woman, Cixi, who is at first just like a concubine of an emperor, but will eventually have the rank of what's called Empress Dowager, and will basically hold massive amounts of political power. And she will make sure that whoever becomes emperor is like a kid. So she will govern several times when there's emperors, and each one is like a kid. And so she governs through them. So she treats the emperors as her puppets. And the big one is this guy, Guangzhou. He reigns, you can see, notice 1871 is when he's born. He becomes emperor in 1875, so he's like 4. So he just does what he's told. It's only later, when he's like 23, that he starts trying to be his own man, and then he quickly is put under house arrest. You may recall that. So you have this system where you have weak emperors who are basically manipulated as puppets by Cixi. Her basic approach to government is some self-strengthening is good. Right? Recall self-strengthening was this policy where we can just get Western technology, we can get some guns, we can build some railroads, no political changes, no social changes, just some technology, some factories, that's all we need. She supported that. She wanted, though, to always maintain the power of the Manchu, so anything that threatened their power, she would oppose. Right? Anything that would threaten their power, she would oppose. So how does Li Hongzhang fit into this? He is one of her trusted officials. He's considered very loyal to the Qing dynasty because he sees them as the ultimate protector of China and Confucian culture, and he knows what he's doing. And he will then try and develop China in self-strengthening lines. He'll help build arsenals, he'll build steamships. He eventually realizes that just having that technology is not enough. You need to have the resources to fund it. So he'll develop coal mines, because steamships and railroads need coal, And he'll also even develop a cotton mill because, rich country, strong army. We have to develop our economy to support all this Western technology. And he will support the international education of Chinese. I think Dagye asked me a question about this. Initially, he supported them going to the United States. The Americans, unfortunately, were too racist, so they ended up going to Europe instead, for the most part. The government students, there were also missionary students who continued to go to the United States. But Chinese government students are going to focus on Europe. He was also an admirable guy in many ways. He's the guy, remember, during the negotiations after the first Sino-Japanese War, he got shot in the face. And he continued to negotiate, but whenever the Japanese were being too hard on China, he would always tap the place where he got shot. So he knew what he was doing. He also will oversee the expansion of power of China into Korea. China's acting like a Western empire. He also helped build the Navy. So a very effective guy, but he's not an emperor, and he's working for Shishi. Right? That's who his primary loyalty is to. Darn, this thing always locks up. While it's locking up, one thing I want to differentiate, just so you understand, there are two Sino-Japanese wars. There's the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, which, remember, Japan won very easily. And then the second Sino-Japanese War is that one from 37 to 45 that becomes a part of World War II. So on the exam, if I refer to first Sino-Japanese War, and I'll give you the year, it was 1894 to 95, I'm talking about that one. If I just say the second Sino-Japanese War, I'm talking about 37 to 45. And hopefully this thing is working now. Of course it's not. Okay, there we go. So section 5 still, the person had a question about 12. Why did the Manchu reject reform? Right? Why did they reject reform? Well, traditionally in China, remember, moral knowledge was more important than technical knowledge, right? Moral knowledge is more important than technical knowledge. And Western reform seemed to challenge this. If our reform is based around developing technology, developing industry, developing science, you're making technical knowledge above moral knowledge, right? You're putting technical knowledge above moral knowledge. Moreover, the most powerful Western civilizations were constitutional. They were democracies. Great Britain, France, the United States, all liberal democracies with constitutions that gave people voting rights. But that's not how the Manchu held power. No one voted the Manchu in. So the Manchu didn't really like the idea of voting. They much preferred the idea of mandate of heaven. So they don't want any kind of political reform, or only very limited political reforms, at least initially, because that would challenge their power. In addition, there's this idea that equality would lead to chaos. Remember, Chinese political thought traditionally emphasized hierarchy. That's how Confucianism works. We have to have hierarchy so everyone knows his place, then we have harmony. If we're all equal, we're going to have chaos. And it's important to stress, it wasn't just the Manchus, but the scholars and gentries benefited from the old system. Remember, their power came from Confucianism and their mastery of Confucian texts. And if all of a sudden you were to change the contents of the exam, say, you know what, instead of studying Confucian ritual, we're going to study math. Those people would lose power. And all the people who were studying for the exams would not be happy, right? If I told you, hey, the exam on Wednesday, it's not going to be on China, it's going to be on France. I don't think you'd be very happy with me. Right? You would not support that. But that's essentially what reform would call for. So there's too many people who benefit from the old system, at least early on. The Manchu benefit and the Gentry benefit. No one had any questions here? Okay, section 5, there were 2 questions, and I realize this can be a little bit complex, but these are both having to do with the 1911 revolution, and I will refer to it on the exam as the 1911 revolution. So just so you're familiar with this, both these things, 24 and 25, have to do with the 1911 revolution. I just want to give you the terms so you can better understand how Chinese see these things. But the Wuchang uprising was in this area here near Wuhan. It's like a group of several cities together that the Chinese abbreviate with Wuchang. That's when they had the bomb-making party that went wrong. Right? They were making the bomb and it accidentally went off. And then they were like, oh geez, we're going to be arrested. Let's just go ahead and start the revolution anyway. And remember, a bunch of soldiers joined them. So that is the Wuchang Rising. And that feeds into then multiple uprisings, which leads to what Chinese call the Jinhai Revolution. So this is the 1911 revolution. It's the Wuchang Rising plus the Jinhai Revolution. You may remember there were some railroad protests as well that kind of fed into this, but no one asked about those. So the 1911 revolution, we have to emphasize, right, and you can just remember it's confusing, right, because it's the Wuchang Rising that's part of it. There's multiple things going on. There's no like single leader. at the beginning of the revolution. It's like a bunch of people just rebelling. So it's very chaotic, right? It's very chaotic. There are massacres of either pro-revolutionary people or Manchus. Right? The pro-revolutionary people will massacre Manchus, the Manchus will massacre Han back. And what will happen is numerous provinces will start seceding from the Qing Empire to form into a republic. So it starts off very chaotic. It starts off in a sense with China falling apart, but then these various provinces will have elections, and Sun Yat-sen will be elected president. He'll become the first president. The revolution does really well at first. It starts to slow down, and then they're afraid, oh geez, if we don't end this thing quickly, the Western powers will get involved, Japan will get involved, and they'll take over Chinese territory. Right? There's this fear among all Chinese and among the Qing, if we keep fighting this, other people are going to take advantage of our weakness, and they'll come in and take over. So there's this fear of foreign intervention. That's why we call it the 1911 Revolution, because it pretty much just takes about a year. Because the Chinese realize that if they keep fighting, Western countries and Japan will profit. The way it then ends, finally, is through this guy, Yuan Shikai. There's a lot of military officers connected to this guy. He had his own army. He was in charge of the Beiyang Army, which means the Northern Army. And he was a disciple of Li Hongzhang. Right? So he had a lot of important political connections. A lot of soldiers were connected to him personally. And so even though the Qing government would force him to retire, you may recall that at a certain point they said his leg was injured and he had to retire. He found out his leg was injured by reading the newspaper. His leg was not, in fact, injured. Right? Just the government said, your leg's injured, you got to retire. But because he had those officers still personally loyal to him, the Qing could not, simply by removing him from his position as commander of the army, actually remove him from power. He kept those personal connections. He kept that power. And so what happened was, to end the war, he's going to step in as mediator. He's going to act as the go-between between the revolutionary forces and the Manchu. Because they want to end this war soon. They don't want to keep fighting the war, end it soon, get this thing over with, so that we can then work on building the new China. And so he will arrange the abdication of the emperor. That's part of the deal, but the emperor's not going to be punished. The emperor's given like a bunch of money. This is Puyi, remember? Given a bunch of money and allowed to still live in the palace. But he gives up. And then you can have a revolutionary government. But he takes care of himself, too, because he demands to become president. That's part of the deal. Right? So he uses his position to benefit not only China by ending the war and bringing a Republic of China into power, he also benefits himself by making sure that he becomes president. You may recall, Sun Yat-sen resigned the presidency, and then he immediately became president the next day. And I had included this image. There's that's little Puyi right there. He actually had an older brother, but his older brother was considered too old, so they made him emperor, so he can control him better, though Jishi is no longer there. And whereas the Qing had forced Chinese to grow their queues, now Chinese are being forced to cut their queues, right? That's, you can't quite see it, but his queue, that's his queue, has been cut off. And then we have the new Republic of China. Okay, section 6, no one had any questions on the first 5. We had 2 on the section, on the second group of 10. What was the conflict regarding Chinese nationalism in the different parts of the former Qing Empire? So remember, what's complicated, and this still, in a sense, influences China today, the Han Chinese wanted to end Manchu domination and get rid of the old dynasty, but they wanted to keep all of the Qing Empire. Right, so we talked about earlier, the Qing Empire consists of multiple parts, like Tibet and Mongolia, Xinjiang, that were not traditionally a part of China. Right, if you look at Ming Dynasty China, it's much smaller than Qing Dynasty China. So the Han Chinese want to get rid of Manchu domination, get rid of the old dynasty, but keep Qing territory. So that's why the new Republic of China looks like this. Right? Tibet's a part of the new Republic of China. Xinjiang is a part of the new Republic of China. Mongolia is. Later on, the Soviet Union will force China to give up its claims over the northern part of this, so that's why it looks a little bit different. But this is what the Chinese envision. Right, so everything is that now basically we keep the old Qing Empire, it's now the Republic of China. And the way they justified this was through things like this, the 5-nation republic. Right, we're a nation of 5 groups of people. Notice, of course, that the Han are on top. Right, they put themselves on top, and that's why you had people like, for example, Mongolia, you have one of the leading lamas in Mongolia. That's a term from Tibetan-style Buddhism. A lama is a leader. I'm not talking about the animal. And he says, you know what? Mongolia was not a part of China. We were a part of the Qing Empire. Qing Empire's gone. We're independent. We're independent. So you have this group of people who say, we don't want to be part of China. Right? We were part of the Qing Empire. We're not part of China. We had this, and I apologize, 8 and 10 are basically the same question. I made a mistake on the study guide, and I asked the same question twice, so I apologize. What role did China play in World War I? Why were Chinese disappointed in the Versailles Treaty? That's basically the same thing as 10. I just tried to make it a little bit more clear, but also what happened that made China feel betrayed. So World War I is complex, but in a nutshell, Japan will declare war on Germany in 1914. And do you remember we talked about Qingdao, that area where the Germans were, and they made the Boxers angry? And especially Qingdao was important because it was in Shandong, which where Chinese believe Confucius was born. So very, very important region. Well, Japan will declare war on Germany in 1914 and then seize that area from Germany. So the Japanese seized Chinese territory that was under the control of the Germans. It was initially Chinese territory. China will later declare war against Germany in 1917. They do not send combat troops, but they send several 100,000 laborers, a good number who will die, but they basically send they send laborers, no combat troops, but that frees up European combat troops to fight. That's kind of the idea. So China makes a material contribution to the war. Right? So the Chinese do act in the war, do help in the war effort. And so when the Versailles Treaty comes around in 1919, the Chinese expect that they'll be rewarded. They expect that Qingdao, this area of Shandong Peninsula, will be given back to them. Instead, it turns out that in order to get Japan to fight Germany, Britain and France had promised Japan it could keep that territory. So Japan is allowed to keep this area. So the Chinese feel betrayed. They say, hey, wait a second, not only did you not give it back to us, we expected we would get it back, and you didn't tell us you already promised it to the Chinese. So they feel really betrayed by the liberal democracies. This is one reason why some Chinese are open to communism, because the liberal democracies behave very badly here, in a sense. This will lead to the May 4th movement, where you have these massive student protests that begin at Beijing University that soon travel throughout all of China. China then will refuse to sign the Versailles Peace Treaty. And this is interesting because it leads to the students they're horrified on one side that China is so weak, that this can be done to them. But they're also happy because they realize now we can bring change. Right? It's partially in response to their protests that the Chinese delegation does not sign the treaty. And their goal is to strengthen the nation state through the radical reform of society. When you think May 4th movement think that, they think change the culture first, then change the politics. That's what you have in AQ, right? Lu Xun's AQ is a story that, we changed the political system first, and it didn't work. We need to change the culture first. We need to criticize Chinese culture, build a new culture, then we can have healthy politics. That's just an image of the May 4th protest. Okay, no questions here. No questions here. No questions here. No questions here. Okay, we finally have one. How has Chiang Kaishek been viewed in the past? This is section 7, question 12. What are some problems with that view? So Chiang Kaishek, not without reason, has not been remembered kindly. I mean, he does lose in the end, right? I mean, he's defeated by the communists. He's forced to leave. And like I said, he could be very brutal. I pointed out, for example, in the rectification campaign that the communists would execute and torture people. But the Chinese nationalists did the exact same thing. So we want to emphasize, right, when this was common in Chinese politics because everything had fallen apart. So he could actually be brutal, and that's not false. Right? That's completely true. One thing that kind of makes things worse for him, though, even though he had laws that would give him control over the press, he never really controlled the press. Right? So images like this, making fun of him, he's got the small head and the big fist. He didn't actually punish those people typically, even though it was technically illegal. So even though he tried sometimes to censor, and he did censor successfully, he wasn't all that good at it. Right? The government was not strong enough. In contrast, the communists controlled the press in their areas. They prevented, you saw what happened to people who criticized Mao Zedong publicly. Right? Bad things happened to them. In addition, Chiang was not good at defending himself. He was a quiet man who did not speak well. He was completely different from his wife, who was a very good speaker. And when things did not go our way, we just put all the blame on him. Right? Why did the communists win? Well, it was the nationalists' fault. It's all their fault, not ours. So he was a good scapegoat for us. My perspective, like I said, is I think the guy had a bad hand. I can think of poker. This guy was not dealt a good hand. I thought he played about as well as he could. He could have done some things differently, but generally, his mistakes are rational. They're understandable. No questions here? No questions here. Okay, what was the Long March? How did it lead to Mao's return to power? What did Mao learn? So you remember in the early 1930s, Chiang Kaishek wanted to crush the communists, right? In the early 1930s, Chiang Kaishek wants to crush the communists. He's having a hard time because remember, much of his army is not loyal to him, right? They had these warlord troops. And the warlord troops don't really want to defeat the communists because if you defeat the communists, that makes Chiang Kai-shek more powerful. You get rid of his major enemy, he gets more power. So why would we do that? So eventually in 1934, he's going to engage in what's called the Fifth Encirclement Campaign. That means he had 4 campaigns before that all failed. Right? So he's having a hard time. And this one, because he has these German-trained troops that are being very careful, is fairly successful. Now, Mao Zedong had traditionally said we should fight with guerrilla tactics. And we're down here, the communists are down here in the Jiangxi Soviet. Remember the Jiangxi Soviet in the early 30s? Mao Zedong initially was in power there, but recall he was later pushed from power. And that led to the rise to power of the Soviet-trained communists. So Mao Zedong is pushed from power, the Soviet-trained communists are in charge, and they say, you know what? Let's fight Mao Zedong, let's fight the nationalists head-to-head. Let's fight them directly, not using guerrilla warfare, and it fails miserably. So Mao Zedong has a strategy of using guerrilla warfare. He's pushed from power during just before this campaign. The Soviet-trained Chinese communists, they say, let's fight Chiang Kai-shek face-to-face, head-to-head, and they lose. They lose a lot. Yes, Dylan, you had a question?
So why was Mao kicked out?
Well, the short answer, if you go back to the slide, basically what happens is the communists had made a lot of promises. He wasn't able to keep all those promises, right? Remember it hasn't been written on, but Liu Shaoqi made this promise, like basically, become communist, everything's perfect. And he wasn't able to keep all those promises. Some people did not like the guerrilla war strategy he followed because, guerrilla war strategy means abandoning your homes and letting the enemy take it. And also, remember he emphasized the peasants. He said, the peasants should be the ones, they're the key class. Other people disagreed with him and said, no, it's the workers. So for basically practical purposes, there were problems and people blamed him for the problems. There were also issues of strategy that people criticized him for, and that led to him being pushed from power. Is that? Okay. Yeah. So then what happens, however, fortunately for the communists, they are able to find some warlord troops who they can bribe, and that makes it a little bit easier for them to break out. But the Long March refers directly to them going all the way from Jiangxi province all the way up here to the north. That's why it's called the Long March. And this, in a sense, is a march of retreat. It's not a march of conquest. It's a march of retreat. It's a march of defeat. Right? In a sense, they're defeated, that's why they have to leave. It's a victory in the sense that they survive. But it's not a march of conquest. Right? There was a real chance for communism to be destroyed here, but they're able to survive and make it all the way up here. And what's key is they lose battles. They get defeated a lot while the Moscow-oriented Chinese communists are in charge. Mao will return to power during the Long March, and it's under him that they survive. Right? So the Long March is literally them just moving from Jiangxi to here. Right? It's a very long march. It's a time when the communists could have been absolutely destroyed. They're not, though. They survive in a large part because of the leadership of Mao Zedong. So this question, what does Mao learn from this? It's like, I'm right. Mao Zedong was right about all this stuff. When people moved away from his strategy, the Chinese communists got defeated and darn near got destroyed. But then he stepped in, and under his leadership, saves them. And that's, I think, a fairly accurate understanding of what happens. The guy was right, other people were wrong. So what Mao Zedong learned was, I need to be in charge, people need to follow me if we want to succeed. If I'm not in charge and other people are leading, things are going to go bad because other people are wrong. And like I said, he's pretty correct in that reading of events. Right? He's fairly correct in that reading of events. Okay, we had some more questions here. Right? How big was Manchuria? We're in section 8. What economic roles did it play? What were the characteristics of Japan's presence in Manchuria? how the Chinese warlord of Manchuria respond, what happened to him. Right, so first of all, remember, Manchuria is huge, right? You think about this, it's not even a single province in China, it's a bunch of provinces. But it's larger than France, Germany, and Austria combined. It accounted for 90% of China's oil, 70% of its iron, more than half of its gold, and a third of its trade. So this is an extraordinarily wealthy place. Almost 60% of the world's soybeans are produced here. So this is a very rich area, and it's also the industrial center of China. So it's not like it's just resources here. They also are able to produce huge amounts of manufactured goods. The problem is Japan controlled one of the railways there, and because of that, we're allowed to station soldiers there. Because this is also important to Japan. By 1931, Japan's foreign investment was 2/3 of what existed in Manchuria. 40% of Japan's trade with China came through Manchuria, and there were 1 million Japanese people living in Manchuria. So the Japanese have a huge interest there. The Chinese warlord, Zhang Zhuolin, who you don't have to remember his name, tried to prevent increasing Japanese influence. He was like, oh my gosh, the Japanese are taking over economically. They'll take over politically if I don't do something. And so he was assassinated by the Japanese military. They blew up his train while he was on it. So it wasn't, just very ham-fisted kind of assassination. His son, Zhang Zhueliang, will come to power, and you can guess he does not like the Japanese. Remember the rule in China, you can't sleep under the same sky as the man who killed your father. So he always wants revenge against the Japanese, and he's the guy that actually kidnaps Chiang Kaishek and forces him to stop attacking communists and to enter into the second united front of the communists and nationalists versus the Japanese. So what happens is Japan is going to be interested in expanding, or Japan faces a difficult situation. With the Great Depression, there's a decline of international trade. Remember, Japan doesn't even have food security. They don't even produce enough food to survive on their own. So they're very dependent on international trade. They're afraid about the Soviet Union, the Western empires expanding their influence, and they start to say, you know what? Why are these Europeans, why are these Americans, why are they in Asia? Asians should rule Asia. Right? So this idea of Pan-Asianism, that Asia should be for the Asians, Asia should be united together under Japanese leadership. Why? Well, they were the first Asian nation to modernize successfully. That was their logic. Right? We're the first ones to do this. Now that's kind of the ideological reasons. But practically speaking, Japan needed resources, right, and an empire to maintain its own security. It needed that, right, and it needs to have direct control over those because of the decline of international trade. And it needs those things it believes, especially the military leaders think, they need that to protect Asia in the face of Western and Soviet threats. The problem is Japan needs to get those resources from China, but they cannot obtain them from a strong united China on terms that the Japanese will find acceptable. So that's going to lead them to invade China in order to help China. Right? That's the fundamental contradiction in Japan's policy. Right? It says we need to come in and help unite the Asians against the Westerners. Chinese people were not opposed to that, but they were opposed to Japan being the leader who gets to tell people what to do and gets to have all of China's resources. So because of this contradiction, the Japanese simply cannot, especially the Japanese military, cannot take the Chinese seriously to understand that this is a different China. They're going to fight back really hard. This isn't the China of the first Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. This is different. In addition, we talked about how the military is the one that are kind of in charge. They're the one dictating China policy. And the Japanese military was run by people, especially the army, who thought that spirit could make up for any material lack of resources. So you don't have enough gasoline, don't worry, your tanks can run on spirit. That was basically the attitude that they had. So that was that question. We had this question next. Who made up the Safety Zone Committee? What role did they play in the rape of Nanjing? So the rape of Nanjing, you remember, was this basically an atrocity where the Japanese army took over Nanjing and the troops engaged in a lot of killing of prisoners, killing of civilians, and a large number of rapes. What makes this different, though, I mean, you could expect, just happens, unfortunately, sometimes in military history. What makes it different is the military authorities allowed this to go on for over a month. Right, so this went on for over a month. That's what makes it different. It was part of an attempt to break the will of the Chinese people to fight. However, Nanjing was an international city, right? It was the former capital, so there were like Western diplomats and Western missionaries there. And they formed in the area, the kind of concession in the area where the Westerners were, they kind of cordoned it off and wouldn't let Japanese soldiers there. And so many Chinese people would flee here in order to receive protection. Right? They would be theoretically safe. Sometimes Japanese soldiers did break into the area, but for the most part, Chinese people who get there were safe.
So it was a zone controlled by Westerners in order to keep Japanese people and themselves safe.
To keep Chinese people safe and themselves safe. Yeah, safe from the Japanese. No one had a question here? 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 No question here. So that then brings us to the announcements. Right, so I'm getting ready to do some more start